I'm still waiting for Lexus to send me their new fire-breathing IS 500, but in the meantime, they've sent me the next best thing in the lineup, the IS 350F Sport. This is not, in fact, a fourth-generation IS, like many people were assuming. This is a refreshed third-generation model. The third generation launched back in 2014, and with the exception of the upcoming IS 500, the engine lineup under the hood is essentially the same as we've seen before. Refreshing rather than redesigning the IS unfortunately makes a great deal of business sense. Sedan sales aren't exactly on a roll in this country, and that's why Lexus has killed off the next size category up in their lineup, the Lexus GS. So for 2021, we have the rear-wheel drive IS, the front-wheel drive ES, and then the rear-wheel drive LS in the sedan lineup. And in the future, it looks like Lexus is going to be focusing a bit more on their crossover lineup, although we are going to be seeing again more high-performance versions of some of their sedans in the future. The car next to me is an F Sport trim IS, so we have a distinctive grille here with the squiggles that we find in F Sport models, no fog lights below, but we do have redesigned headlight modules. They're a multi-module LED with this very distinctive swoosh here, and the swoosh is no longer separate from the headlight. The current luxury sedan market is really interesting because in some ways we have fewer options than we had before, and in some ways we have more options than we had before. Since traditional sedan sales like this haven't exactly been on fire, some car companies like BMW and Mercedes are attempting to coupify everything in their lineup. So we have a 3 Series sedan and we have a 4 Series Grand Coupe, which is honestly a 3 Series sedan with a slightly altered roofline. Over here on the Lexus side, we just have the Lexus IS, and over at Jaguar, they've actually killed off the Jaguar XE for this model year. At 184.3 inches long, this is almost exactly the same size as the Mercedes-Benz C-Class and the Genesis G70, one of the newest entries in this segment. But it is shorter on the outside than the Audi A4, or especially the Infiniti Q50. The Q50 is something of a tweener in the luxury lineup. It is definitely bigger on the outside than most of the entries in this category, but it's not quite as big as something like a Lexus LS or even some of the larger entries in the midsize category. Lexus has continued to refine the signature lighting element designs in their vehicles, and we're going to start to see more of this particular design in new Lexus models going forward, where the little Lexus swoosh continues from one side all the way across the trunk lid to the other. In an odd twist, these are combination LED lights, so the turn signal is incandescent, the brake light and the backup light, oddly enough, are LEDs. At the bottom of the bumper, we find dual exhaust tips and a slightly tweaked rear bumper design for the F Sport model. The engine lineup in the IS is a little complicated, so hold on to your hats. The base engine is in the IS 300. It's not a 3-liter engine, it's a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine. It produces 241 horsepower and 258 pound-feet of torque. That engine is mated only to an 8-speed automatic transmission, and rear-wheel drive is your only option. That will give you 25 miles per gallon, and it's the most efficient version of the IS in the United States. That's because we don't get the IS 300H, which you do find in other world markets. That uses the Lexus full hybrid system, somewhat similar to what we saw in the outgoing Lexus GS hybrid. If you want all-wheel drive, the IS 300 offers all-wheel drive, but not with the same engine. Instead, it uses a variant of this engine, a 3.5-liter V6, only it produces less power than this, 260 horsepower and 236 pound-feet of torque, and it uses a different automatic transmission, a 6-speed auto instead of the 8-speed auto. Then we have the IS 350, which is a 3.5-liter V6 engine, as its number would indicate. This produces 311 horsepower and 280 pound-feet of torque. You can get it with rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive, but the same two transmissions I mentioned before. Rear-wheel drive gets you the 8-speed auto, that's the one I'm driving today. All-wheel drive gets you a 6-speed automatic transmission, and that's the least efficient one currently on sale at 22 miles per gallon. Coming a little bit later, for the 2022 model year, there's going to be the IS 500 F Sport Performance that will replace this with a 5-liter V8 engine. Again, the number indicates the displacement. It's mated to an 8-speed automatic and rear-wheel drive only, but you'll notice it is not an ISF. According to Lexus, the reason for that is that it doesn't quite meet the same level of performance that they would expect out of a full-on F. So it seems that in the Lexus lineup, we're going to have F Sport Performance, and we're going to have full-on F that will take things up to even the next level. It's worth noting that that 5-liter V8 engine will be the only naturally aspirated V8 engine in this entire segment. I find the front seats in the F Sport versions of the IS a bit more comfortable than the base versions because we have more bolstering on the seat bottom cushion and on the seat back cushion. But keep in mind that if you're a larger person than I am, you might find these just a little bit tight. However, unlike we see from some European sport seats, the shoulder area is pretty roomy, so I think that a lot of people will find these seats pretty comfortable. We don't have a four-way adjustable lumbar support, however, which I've always thought was an odd omission from the IS and one that they have not rectified for 2021. Unlike other Lexus models, this has a manual tilt telescopic steering column, but it does have a pretty large range of motion. It's worth noting that the passenger seat does not have the same range of motion as the driver's seat, however. Compact luxury cars seem to attract a decent number of shoppers that formerly had a mid-size mainstream sedan. So the important thing to keep in mind about the IS is that on the inside and on the outside, much like the BMW 3 Series and the C-Class, etc., this is a compact sedan, and it's a compact rear-wheel drive sedan. So the interior dimensions are going to be a bit more compact than a front-wheel drive vehicle with the same exterior proportions, generally speaking, of course. So if you're looking for more interior room, definitely take a look at the Lexus ES, or if you can afford it, the Lexus LS. Sitting right here behind myself, I have about 2 to 3 inches of legroom, depending on exactly where I might be interacting with that rear seat back, but I can't actually scoot over to the right side of the vehicle because that front seat is all the way back in its tracks, and my legs simply don't fit back there. You won't just find more legroom in the Lexus ES than the Lexus IS, you'll find more width across the rear bench and also a bit more headroom. Although headroom isn't as bad as you might think back here in the IS. I can't really put my head back to the rear headrest, but sitting in a more natural position, my hair is just barely brushing the ceiling. The roof bumps up quite a bit from this opening right here. What makes the Lexus lineup unusual is that the next step up in the Lexus lineup size-wise is really just a side step over price-wise, the Lexus ES. It will give you a significantly larger interior and a significantly larger trunk. This trunk is just under 11 cubic feet, putting this among the smallest in this category. In fact, there are a number of plug-in hybrids that will have a bigger trunk than the Lexus IS without a hybrid system. If I dive under the load floor, we find a temporary spare tire, and that is part of the reason, because most of the European competition doesn't have a spare, and instead they give you that exact cargo area to use for your bags. It's conceivable that if Lexus ditched the compact spare tire in the IS, then cargo capacity would be pretty comparable to the European options that don't have one. As a result of the smaller dimensions, I have to give this trunk 5 out of 10 points in the exclusive Trunk Comfort Index, but it does have a handy helper handle to help you close the trunk lid. As we look around this interior together, keep in mind that we are in an IS 350, so obviously there are going to be some things in here that we don't find in the base model. We have a pretty standard sized moonroof, height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, height adjustable headrests as well. This vehicle has Lexus's imitation leather upholstery. In an interesting touch, the upholstery is bonded permanently to the foam seat structure, so you don't get the same kind of wrinkling over time that you can get with traditional leather upholstery. These seats are both heated and ventilated, and as you can see, we have that pretty aggressive bolstering, but it does cut back out right there around the shoulder, so it is pretty roomy for those wider shouldered people. Moving over to the front doors, we don't find too much of a change versus last year's model. This model has really dark wood trim. It's almost difficult to tell that that's real wood trim, but it is. It's just so darkly tinted. Moving over to the dashboard, the bulk of the shapes have not changed, but here in the middle of the dash, we do have a color touchscreen infotainment system that's positioned a little bit closer to the driver and front passenger. As you can see, it supports smartphone integration, but it is worth noting that this interface still requires the use of the remote touch controller. So if, for instance, I'm over here on the navigation map, you'll notice that there's no way to go back home to go back to CarPlay. So I have to hit the menu button in that touch controller, then I can go back and find CarPlay or some of those other options. Below that screen, we find 2 large air vents, analog clock right there, the controls for the automatic climate control system, 2 zones here. We have the same sort of touch slider that we've had for a while in the IS. It's getting a little bit easier to use, I think, than the time that I first saw this in a Lexus model. Below the controls for the climate control system, we find some physical controls for the infotainment system, also a single slot optical disc player. This model has the Mark Levinson sound system, so we have a little logo there. And in previous versions of the IS, this was a little door right down here, if I can find the little grip. But in this version, it just has some sticky tape, and then we no longer have an SD card behind there. But oddly enough, we still have the door. We find the controls for the heated and ventilated seats up here, a pretty traditional gated shifter down here with drive and a manual mode. Controls for the vehicle's drive modes here, Sport, Sport Plus, Normal, Comfort, and Eco, Snow, traction control, disable, auto brake hold, 2 big cup holders. The controller for that infotainment system, it's a touchpad controller. Fortunately, you don't have to use it other than just the menu button here. Definitely get used to the menu button. We then have a large center armrest with sort of a wrist rest section right there. The full LCD instrument cluster is one of the smaller ones in this segment. It has a physical ring that slides side to side in the F Sport model and then gives you the pretty typical readouts from tire pressure to infotainment information, trip computer readouts, status of the vehicle's active safety systems, etc. The steering wheel is a round 3-spoke design with moderate sport grips on the sides, paddle shifters on the back. We have down on the left and then up on the right. The controls for that multifunction LCD are over here on the right side of the steering wheel, along with some controls for the radar adaptive cruise control that's standard. We have a distance button there, lane keeping button, and then the rest of the cruise control controls are on that stock. So this is one of the older steering wheel designs because Toyota and Lexus are now putting them on the face of the steering wheel. On this side, we have controls for the infotainment system, as well as phone buttons and a voice command button. It hasn't been that long since I spent a little bit of time in the refreshed IS, so I'm just going to go ahead and post those scores up there at the top of your screen right now from the last review, but I'm going to tweak them a little bit for this IS350 because this is the faster version. This model went 0 to 60 in 5.6 seconds, definitely faster than the last one I drove, which was the 2-liter turbocharged model. And because this one has the optional summer tires on it, this one certainly stopped shorter at just 109 feet. Starting out on the gravel road that I'm on here, you'll definitely notice the adaptive suspension system in this model. If I put it in Sport Plus, things certainly get as firm as you'd suspect out of a sporty intended sedan in this segment. And if I put it in Eco or Normal, it's definitely daily driver livable. I love adaptive suspension systems, and the one in the IS is definitely in that pack. Now, if you're looking for the next level in comfort, there are going to be a few options in this similar price range that will have an adaptive air suspension. Those will give you a more comfortable ride, but they're relatively few and far between. Of course, if you're interested in the most cushy ride, that would be found in the Lexus ES, which is going to be about the same price as the IS. I've said it before, but it's worth repeating that there are always pros and cons to every engineering decision when designing a new vehicle. The naturally aspirated engines that we find in pretty much all of Lexus's performance lineup really gives them a different characteristic and a different feel than the European competition, or something like the Genesis G70 or the Infiniti Q50. The downside to this engineering decision is obviously 0 to 60 acceleration. The IS350 is going to be slower than something like the BMW M340i. Although, in a logical world, you might want to compare this more directly against something like a BMW 330i, because price-wise, the IS350 and the BMW 330i end up pretty close together. And you might consider the new IS500 more of a direct competitor to the M340i. And then if at some later date Lexus releases a full-on ISF, that theoretically could be the competitor to the BMW M3, but that is still shrouded in mystery. The benefit to a naturally aspirated engine is the way that it delivers power. There's no turbo lag, the power builds very naturally, it has a great engine exhaust note because there's no turbocharger interfering with the exhaust sounds, and of course we don't get any of that characteristic turbocharger whish or swoosh sound. That's a pro and con depending on how you feel about it. Obviously, reliability is going to be a pro for a naturally aspirated engine as well, because quite simply there are fewer parts going on with this engine than a comparable turbocharged engine or twin turbocharged engine like you might find in the Infiniti Q50 or the BMW or the Mercedes competition. Part of the refresh for 2021 was tweaking the suspension, the steering, and pretty much all aspects of the way the IS feels out on the road. The IS was already more engaging than a decent number of the European competition. Honestly, the steering feel, the connectedness, the driver to the vehicle, the handling ability, etc., and just the refinement and precision was already above where we see the BMW 3 Series, the Audi A4, or the Mercedes-Benz C-Class, and then Lexus has tweaked that up a notch with the 2021 model. It's just not as fast, so it really depends on exactly what you're looking for. If I were looking for a vehicle to drive out on my favorite winding mountain road like this at, say, 9/10 of the vehicle's ability all the time, I would certainly take the Lexus IS over the BMW 3 Series. This simply has a more engaging feel. This is also more engaging than the Audi A4 or A5 because this has a better weight balance than the Audi lineup. And the Mercedes-Benz C-Class is tuned to be a little bit softer unless you buy some of the AMG variants, and then some of them can be a little bit too hardcore for my taste. And I think Lexus has struck exactly the right balance here. There are a few small luxury sedans out there that combine the feel that we have in the Lexus and the precision and handling ability with some added thrust. The Alfa Romeo Stelvio comes immediately to mind, as does the Jaguar XE. Now, unfortunately, the Jaguar XE is no longer sold, and the Stelvio, well, it's not exactly the most reliable vehicle in this segment. Bottom lining the IS out on the road has always been a little bit tricky for me, because this vehicle has a level of precision, a level of handling ability, and a little bit more steering engagement than we find in the vast majority of the European competition. Especially some of the competition like the Volvo S60, which is a front-wheel drive vehicle, and just does not have the same level of connection that we find in the Lexus IS. Again, if I were shopping for a vehicle simply on suspension dynamics, handling ability, steering feel, etc., this would certainly be above something like like the BMW 3 Series or the Mercedes-Benz C-Class. Now, when it comes to acceleration, something that a lot of shoppers are honestly a little bit more interested in than handling precision, then the Europeans certainly have the upper hand, but it will depend on exactly how you feel about these two aspects of vehicle performance. If you live in an area like I do where there are a ton of fun winding mountain roads, I would probably give up the added thrust that we find in many of those European competitors to have the level of handling precision and suspension precision that we find in the Lexus IS. However, if you live in suburbia or if you live in an area that's very flat with a lot of straight roads, then you might want to favor the added acceleration that we find in some of those competitors or the improved fuel economy that we find in some of the other options as well. But as always, be sure and let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section. The more I think about the Lexus IS, the more I have to admit being a little bit torn about it. It's definitely fun to drive, it's well crafted, gets high reliability metrics, and it has more emotion than most of the Lexus lineup, with the exception of the LC and the RC. But there are other really excellent options out there in the luxury segment, and the IS is starting to feel a little bit old. Lexus did give it a refresh for 2021. I wish they'd given us an updated infotainment system that didn't just give us the touchscreen, but also change some of the software layout. The LCD instrument cluster also could use a little bit of a refresh. And then the center console, I think, just feels a little bit older than some of the brand new Lexuses that we're going to be seeing coming up very soon. But on the other hand, the IS is really well priced. Keep in mind that options tend to get pretty expensive on the European competition. So a Lexus IS 300 starts at $39,050, and that's a little bit closer than you might think to a BMW 228i, because even though the base price of the BMW 2 Series Grand Coupe is relatively low, by the time you start adding options onto it, it'll really end up within the price range of that IS 300. And the IS 300 has a bit more standard feature content, especially if you're interested in driver assistance technologies like the complete suite of Lexus safety tech that we find standard on all IS models. And more importantly, you'll also get a rear-wheel drive vehicle, one that's a bit closer to the BMW 3 Series that you see on your screen right now. The IS 350 at $42,950 is more than a BMW 330i, but again, we get more standard feature content. Performance is not going to be too far off. Of course, it will depend on exactly what you want out of your luxury vehicle. Do you like the feeling of a turbocharged engine? The 8-speed automatic transmission in the BMW definitely is more of a slick shifter than the IS 350. And I have to admit that the IS 350's all-wheel drive system is a bit of a bummer because when you choose all-wheel drive, you have to step down into the older 6-speed automatic transmission. So not only do you get added weight to the vehicle, you get the older transmission, and that's one of the reasons that 0 to 60 times are definitely going to be slower if you choose the IS with all-wheel drive. It also is a little bit peculiar in the lineup that the IS 300 all-wheel drive isn't the 2-liter turbo, instead it's a detuned V6 engine. Nobody knows exactly how the IS 500 will be priced, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's well within the range of the BMW M340i. Performance is probably going to be well within that range also. And then, theoretically, at some point in the future, it seems that Lexus might be giving us a full-on ISF model. We don't know whether that's going to be in this generation or the next generation of the IS, however. Now, with this realigned world, where the base IS is more of a Mercedes-Benz CLA, Audi A3, or BMW 2 Series Grand Coupe competitor, and then the IS 350 is more of a BMW 330i, C300, or perhaps a 4 competitor, now the IS lineup makes a little bit more sense in some ways. The IS 300 certainly isn't swift compared against a base BMW 330i, but it is on the other hand an awful lot more dynamic and bigger and roomier than a CLA, an A3, a 2 Series, and of course it's rear-wheel drive, so it's going to have a very different driving dynamic, more like the BMW 3 Series. But Lexus has spent a little bit more time than BMW dialing in the steering and the driving dynamics and just making it feel more connected to the driver. I definitely think the IS 300 is more fun than the BMW 3 Series, definitely more fun than the Audi A4 as well. Now in terms of sales, the fourth bestseller in this segment is the Acura TLX, and this is a little bit tricky because the TLX is less expensive, $37,500 starting. The 2-liter turbo is standard, and it's a more peppy 2-liter turbo than we find in the IS 300. That base model TLX is definitely pretty swift, but the TLX feels bigger and heavier than the IS. It's front-wheel drive as standard. You can get Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system if you want, but it's never going to change the weight balance and the driving dynamics of the vehicle to make it like the IS 300. The IS 300 and 350 are always going to be more fun to drive. Making things a bit more complicated, is the TLX a Lexus ES competitor or is it an IS competitor? Since it is front-wheel drive, and on the outside, it's honestly a little bit closer to the Lexus ES in terms of overall dimensions. After a week with the Lexus IS and then some time to mull over my thoughts, I'm really no closer to a decision on the Lexus IS, so let me know what you think about it down there in the comment section. I think that all 5 of the vehicles that we've talked about so far are excellent options, and there are logical reasons to buy all of them. The biggest and most logical reason to buy the Lexus IS is if you value handling, precision, driving dynamics, long-term resale value, and of course cost of ownership and reliability a little bit more than 0 to 60 acceleration or a fresher cabin. In terms of general cabin design, I think most of the competition feels fresher and a little bit more luxurious and perhaps a little bit more cohesive than the current generation IS, with the exception of the TLX. There are a few interior components in the TLX that I think just don't quite match, but it does feel a little bit more modern than what we see in the Lexus IS. But on the other hand, if I were going to buy one of these vehicles and then keep it for 10 years, I would probably get the Lexus IS. If I were leasing a vehicle, however, then I might get one of the German options. As always, let me know what you think about that in the comments section. Head over to facebook.com/AlexNauto so you can see what I'm driving this week. You can also go to the merch store at aoamerch.com and buy shirts right like the one I'm wearing here. I'll see all of you next week.